We want to welcome back to C-SPAN's Washington Journal Representative Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Good morning.
Good morning, Steve. Nice to be with you.
One of the issues we want to talk about, affordable housing. Is it more or less affordable now than it may have been 5 or 10 years ago for people to own a home?
It depends on the region of the country, but I think it's fair to say that in general we have a very severe housing crisis, and it's a situation that the Congress really has not dealt with. Unfortunately, the President is putting less money into affordable housing than we need, and less money than, in fact, we put in last year. In my part of the country, in Vermont, in certain areas of Vermont, you have vacancy rates which are a fraction of 1%. When a house or apartment is available, dozens and dozens of people try to get that apartment or that house. Prices as a result are inflated because of the lack of demand. And what you end up having in this country today is not only homelessness, where in some cases kids and their parents are living out on the street, but you have a situation where people who are working 40 hours a week in regions of our country simply cannot afford the housing that they need because their wages are not sufficient to pay the high rents or the mortgages that are necessary. So the end result is not only homelessness and so forth, but you have 13 million Americans who are paying at least 50% of their limited incomes for housing. And it's very hard to take care of your basic needs when that's the case. So we have introduced the National Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which for the first time would really pump substantial sums of money into the construction of affordable housing throughout this country. We have, if you can believe it, 2,000 organizations from church groups, and yesterday there was a press conference where hundreds of church groups indicated their support for this, we have 175 co-sponsors, and I think there is growing support in order to deal with the housing crisis right now.
We'll get to your calls in just a moment. The numbers will be on your screen. Also, our email address, journal@cspan.org, if you have a question or comment for Representative Sanders. A number of locations, New York City among them, have put in place over the years price controls for rent. Do they work?
In some cases they do work, sure. In some cases they don't. If you have what's called rent control, and if you have that, then it often creates a situation where builders are not going to build any more housing because they can't make enough money. But I think in some places that is appropriate.
Could this same thing happen with your proposal?
No, not at all. What we are doing is providing over a 5-year period some $26 billion to go into affordable housing. That money is going to the state. There's a matching program. States will use the money as best they see fit. But the bottom line is you're not going to solve the problem unless you build housing. And one of the side benefits of a massive housing program in this country is you're going to create over 1 million decent paying jobs, which will be an economic stimulus all over this country. So the dilemma that we have is because we have a minimum wage, which was totally inadequate at $5.15 an hour, where we have a situation where millions and millions of people are working for below livable wages. There is no question but you're going to need the government to play an active role if we're going to address the housing crisis, and that's what our legislation does.
Bath, Maine, good morning on our independent line for Congressman Sanders.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much, C-SPAN, for having Mr. Sanders on. Mr. Sanders, I think you my favorite person in Congress. I and my husband supported you in your last election go, and we will always support you. You are the best congressman that we have. And I'd like to ask you a question about housing. In the old days, there used to be a thing called HUD, and I noticed that they don't get very much money anymore, and a lot of it has gone private. We have a big house in our town in Bath that used to be government-run, wonderfully run, and now it is gone into private hands and has gone downhill. Could you give me some more background on the death of HUD?
Well, when Gingrich came in, you have to understand that housing doesn't have a strong constituency. Most of middle class or working class or lower income people who benefit from publicly assisted housing don't make $25,000 contributions to the Republican Party or to the Democratic Party. And many of them don't vote. When Gingrich came in, they really decimated HUD. In recent years, more money has gone into it. But for many Republicans, there is no question that there is a movement toward privatization. In my city of Burlington, where I was mayor for 8 years, you have senior citizen housing, which is safe, which is comfortable, where there are very long waiting lines for seniors in order to get into it, because it provides the most affordable, good housing for people in our community, and that's true all over this country. So the bottom line is, whether you're talking about senior citizens, many of whom are just getting by on Social Security, or low-income families, the government must play a role, either through public housing authorities or through working with their communities in other respects.
Our guest has been in the House of Representatives since 1991, a native of Brooklyn, New York. His hometown now is Burlington, graduate of the University of Chicago, and we'll get a call from Baltimore on the Democrats line. Good morning.
Oh, I have a question about taxes, and I'd like Mr. Sanders to maybe elaborate on. I think part of the housing issue really comes down to taxing the poor in this country, and if you could just sort of discuss that and maybe how that could help provide more of an opportunity for working families to afford more housing.
Well, obviously, in terms of taxes, one of the most egregious things that is going on right now, before we get to the housing issue, and which is a problem for every aspect of life, is, as you know, the president and the Republican leadership have pushed through huge tax breaks, some $400 or $500 billion over a 10-year period, to the wealthiest 1%, people with a minimum income of $375,000 a year. So if you are a senior citizen who can't find decent housing, and the president or others say, well, there's just no money available, please keep in mind that apparently there was enough money available to provide hundreds of billions of dollars to the wealthiest 1%. In terms of taxes and housing, we all know that if you're in the middle class or the upper middle class, or you're rich, you get a mortgage deduction when you pay your taxes. On the other hand, if you're paying rent, you don't get that benefit. So clearly the tax structure in terms of housing, you get more tax breaks when you're in the upper middle class or the upper class than you do if you are renting. But the bottom line is that in a civilized, democratic society in the 21st century, we should not be having children sleeping out on the street. We should not be having people living in decrepit trailers in rural America all over this country. We have got to make a commitment to address this very serious problem, and unfortunately Congress has not done that. My legislation uses the surplus from the FHA, which Deloitte & Touche estimated to be some $26 billion over a 7-year period. And we say, let's put that money into affordable housing, and once and for all, let us create a situation where everybody in this country can live in comfortable, safe, and reasonably priced housing.
It has been almost a year since your colleague, Senator Jim Jeffords, switched from the Republican Party to an independent. First of all, did you advise him on that? And has it changed the dynamics here in Washington?
Well, it sure did change the dynamics, and I've known Jim for 30 or so years. The fact that I was elected as an independent in the state of Vermont, have done well politically, I think created an opening for him to say it would not be politically suicidal. We are very proud of what Jeffords did. We think it would be very unfortunate for this country today if you had a Republican president, a Republican House, and the Republican Senate. And I think most of the people in the state of Vermont, although not everybody, feels the same way.
Why does Vermont have this streak of independence?
Well, it's gone way, way back. I must confess that it's gone back to the very earliest times of our statehood. In fact, Vermont was an independent republic for a while, and there was a lot of debate, as a matter of fact, whether they should join the United States, whether they should join Canada, or stay as an independent republic. I think we were a state that was founded by small, independent farmers. It was a very democratic state. Women from the very first days played an important role. Our soldiers, I think per capita for states, contributed more in terms of their lives to the Civil War and the fight against slavery than any other state in this country. We were very strong against McCarthyism in the 1950s. So I think we have hardworking, independent-minded people who prefer to do things their own way, to take a hard look at the political process, who don't necessarily want to follow every trend that takes place in this country. We believe in small towns where people get to know each other, where they trust each other, where you don't just make a fast buck, where you trust people because you know them. We're very proud of the values of our state.
Next call for Congressman Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, is from Emporia, Kansas, on our independent line. Good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to make one comment first before the reason I called. You don't sound very independent to me. You sound very Democrat, against big business, and very much pro-government, getting involved in things, and that is something I don't like. But I rent a couple of houses here in Emporia that I rent. I think I try to keep them up. Every year, my taxes raise on them, and then that has to be passed on to people that you want to have. I also I've had a couple of HUD houses. I've had a mentally and physically challenged guy in one of mine for 10 years or over. I've also had some who are drug addicts who have people move in with them who don't know where their kids are, and she couldn't even afford to pay me $2 a month because she knew the system. She's very capable of going out and getting a job. There's a reason why us out here complain about HUD. There's a place for it, but there has to be people. I called my HUD offices, and they need to follow up on these kind of people. She just moved on, and that is the kind of stuff that irritates the people like us who own homes, who try to provide a nice place, and then we have people come in that want to provide all these other things, and then my rent has to go up.
Thanks for the call. We'll get a response.
Well, I mean, I think she obviously has a point. Sometimes there are bad tenants. I think one of the things that is going on around the country, which we do in Vermont, is you provide tenant counseling. I mean, you tell people that the rent has got to be paid every month. You tell people that it is unacceptable to be destroying the furniture. You give people the kinds of background and help they need to be good tenants.
In about 36 states, there are just over 250 trust funds in cities and states and localities around the country. What does this mean?
Well, a community land trust is a situation where you have public funding, where homes are purchased or apartments are developed, which remain perpetually affordable. And we started one of those programs when I was mayor of the city of Burlington. The problem sometimes is if you build for-profit housing, you could even start off with a situation where the prices are reasonable, but year after year the prices go up, and then at a certain period they become unaffordable, and you're still back to where you began. When you have perpetually affordable housing, that means is that people own the house but not the land underneath it. So the value of the property, of the rents, remain affordable in perpetuity, and that is what we need.
Buckley, Washington, on the Republican line. Good morning.
Hi. I was calling because I did want you to know that we started out with the Farm Home Administration, and I really did appreciate the help we did get from the government at that time to make the other viewer feel a little bit better. But our problem is we own a home in northern Idaho. That was our first home. We paid it off. It's in a small town, but the small towns are now folding up. And we've pretty well had to rent the house out, like the last woman said, to people that don't appreciate it, didn't appreciate the low rent that we gave them, and we're now in Buckley, Washington, trying to support 2 homes, and it's very, very frustrating.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the issues that you're talking about is probably because of the collapse of many rural communities around this country in Idaho and elsewhere. Housing values, in fact, are not going up, but are going down, and that raises another problem. And I should mention this, one of the issues that we have been working very hard on is to try to protect family farming in the state of Vermont. Dairy farmers in my state, in the Midwest, and elsewhere have been losing their farms in very rapid rates. We're seeing the consolidation of the industry. So what this woman is talking about is that in many regions of this country, rural America is becoming economically extremely depressed. Housing values are going down. And one antidote to that is to protect family-based agriculture. So we're trying to change federal policy so we don't give huge subsidies to the large agribusiness corporations, but develop national policy which protects the little guy and sustains rural America. And when you do that, by the way, you will continue to have decent values for housing in rural America.
Steubenville, Ohio, Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. Bernie, say, I'm really pleased to get to talk to you because we have the same last name.
There you go.
And I also had a brother and an uncle who was named Bernie Sanders. I just thought it might be an interesting item to you.
Okay.
And something I'd like to ask you, I've watched you sometimes on C-SPAN when they show the different branches of the government there, and I know that you being an independent sponsor a lot of things that the Democrats or the Republicans don't. And I just wondered, why is it that more independents can't get elected to office?
Well, that's a good question. And the bottom line is that it is very, very hard. The Republicans and Democrats raise substantial sums of money. Many people were brought up in families that were Democratic or Republican, and that's what they continue to vote. But I think that's beginning to change. I think all over this country, people are seeing that both political parties are dominated by big money interests. Both political parties spend more time hustling money from the wealthy than they do trying to spend time representing the needs of the middle class and working families. What I try to do as an independent congressman is say, I don't have to represent the rich and large corporations. They have all the representation they need in Congress. I try to represent the middle class and working families in an economy, despite all that we hear from the media, is not doing well for tens and tens of millions of people. The fact of the matter is that the average American worker today is working longer hours for lower wages than was the case 25 years ago. We have a trade policy which is a disaster. Large corporations are taking our jobs to China, laying off American workers. We're asked to compete against people there who make 20 cents an hour. Minimum wage is inadequate. We have 41 million Americans without any health insurance. Prescription drug costs are off the wall while the pharmaceutical industry makes huge profits. So I think it's important that people come together and stand up for the middle class and working class of this country to take on the richest 1% who own more wealth than the bottom 95%. And that's what I try to do. And I think we have support for that in Vermont and growing support all over this country. And if the Republicans and Democrats don't begin to represent working families in this country, I think you're going to see more and more people going outside of the two-party system.
Congressman Sanders is a former professor at Harvard, also taught in upstate New York at Hamilton College, the mayor of Burlington in the 1980s, and elected to the House of Representatives in 1990. Next is Sacramento. Good morning.
Good morning, and good morning, Bernie. Thank you for your work regarding the housing. I have a suggestion on how it could be funded, and that is to remove the subsidized housing that we support in Israel, vis-a-vis the settlements, vis-a-vis our giveaways to Egypt and to Israel and Turkey. All countries have, these countries have violations of human rights to the extreme.
Well, I think we have to take a hard look at our foreign policy all over the world. I think we have to remember that there are 1 billion people in this world who are living on less than $1 a day. And I think the United States and other industrialized countries, from a moral perspective as well as for our own national security, have got to do everything that we can to improve life for the poorest people in this world. So I would agree with you that we want to take a hard look at how we spend foreign policy dollars, but that's not only Egypt and Israel, that is all over the world.
On the Republican line, Chillicothe, Missouri, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, caller.
I'm calling to emanate that lady that called a while ago. I think she was on the Democratic line, where she said that the taxes were so hard on people that were renting from the housing unit. And I don't see why you have to have rental property that's so expensive right now.
Well, I think, again, very often, obviously the federal government collects taxes, but sometimes I think what the caller is talking about are local property taxes, and that's a decision made in different communities and by state government. But to the degree that the federal government gets its priorities right, does not provide $100 billion a year in corporate welfare, does not fund military weapon systems that we don't need, does not give huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country. Among other things, we can adequately fund education, which is often the most expensive need of local communities, and you can lower taxes for average people in those communities. So it's a question of getting our federal priorities right. No tax breaks for billionaires, more money for education, which will provide better schools in our communities and be able to lower local property taxes.
An email, Congressman Sanders, that follows up on that. To what extent does state and federal environmental regulations restrict construction of affordable housing, no matter who signs the check for the construction costs?
There is all over this country a problem of what is called NIMBYism, and that is not in my backyard. And that is a real problem from one end of this country to the other in terms of affordable housing. The argument about environmental regulations is sometimes what people do may be wrong, but bottom line, we live on a planet which has very serious environmental problems. Sometimes folks think that a excessive government regulation is zoning or preventing housing from going into marshlands or areas where it should not go into. The bottom line is you need to protect the environment. We need to build affordable housing. I think we can do both in an intelligent way.
You can get more information on this housing proposal by logging on to house.gov/Sanders. It's also available on C-SPAN's website. This is what it looks like as we get a call from the Democrats line, Los Angeles.
If I may, Steve, also mention we have a website, bernie.house.gov, which is a good website. We hope people will click in.
I think it's the same one up there, isn't it?
Bernie.house.gov is what it is.
Go ahead, Los Angeles.
Congressman, President Bush, Tommy Thompson, and other Republicans are claiming that because the welfare rolls are down by 50% over the past 5 years, that the welfare reform bill passed in 1996 was a success. And yet poverty is about the same, homelessness is up. What should be done? Do you think the welfare reform bill that was passed 5 years ago was a success? And if not, what should we do about it?
I voted against it, and I think sometimes the quote-unquote success of it is because during the 90s we had a large number of low-paying jobs, so people could get off of welfare and go out and get those jobs. My fear is that as those jobs disappear and you're going to have women staying home with kids, and the president is also asking people to work more without putting more money into childcare. So I think unless you're going to provide strong child care benefits, unless you're going to make sure that people can get to work, we have got to protect the children. We want people to get to work, but there have to be decent jobs there so that people can sustain their kids.
Camdenton, Missouri, you're next. Good morning.
Hi, my name is Danny. I'd like to congratulate Mr. Sanders on the work that he's doing. Everything that you said as far as how the big businesses and corporations affecting our economy is true. And also you touched on the environmental issues. I was wondering, do you have any suggestions as far as getting more attention to this? Because I agree with you. I think the more that people get the knowledge of it, that they will be more aware of it and be willing to do something about it.
I tell you, one of the real concerns that I have is when we talk about corporate control over this country and corporate control over the political parties and companies taking jobs to China, we should also, etc. We should also recognize that there's a lot of corporate control over the media. If you look at CBS, NBC, ABC, these are owned by large multinational corporations. Radio is increasingly owned by fewer and fewer large companies. I worry very much that some of the most important issues facing our country do not get the kind of discussion that they deserve. By the way, I want to congratulate C-SPAN for being one of the avenues that allows for that serious discussion with different points of view. Let me give you just one example. The United States has the most unfair distribution of wealth and income of any country, a major country on earth. Richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 95%. Now, some people may say, well, so what's the problem? CEOs of large corporations now make 500 times more than their workers. What's the problem? I think that there's a problem, but I think that that's an issue that should be debated. How often do we hear that issue debated? We are the only country in the industrialized world that does not have a national health care program guaranteeing health care to all people, and yet we spend twice as much per person on health care as anybody else, and yet 41 million Americans have no health insurance. People on Medicare can't get prescription drugs. Now, you may argue, somebody may argue, national health care is not a good idea. Where do we have that debate? The average American is working longer hours today for lower wages than was the case 30 years ago. The economy is not working well for the middle class or working class. Where do we have that debate? You'll hear a lot about Robert Blake. I hope you're not going to have any programs on Robert Blake. But, who cares? Who cares about Gary Condon's sex life? Let's talk about the important issues facing the American people. But I think with Fox, with CBS, ABC, NBC, politics becomes sensationalism, it becomes gossip, and I think that is very dangerous for American democracy. I respect people who have different points of view. We're a democracy. But I am so worried that the American people are not engaged in serious political debate, and I think corporate control over the media, which is getting worse, is one of the problems.
Have you or can you define yourself politically?
Yeah, I am a democratic socialist, similar to the democratic socialist parties in Great Britain, France, Scandinavia. And I believe that government should play an important role in making sure that all of our people have health care, that our kids are able to go to college, that we have a more fair distribution of wealth that we have right now, that we protect the environment. I think that in a civilized society in the year 2002, it is not acceptable that people don't have health insurance, that elderly people can't afford prescription drugs, that families are going in debt to send their kids to college. We are a great nation. We have a great deal to be proud of. But we need mass organizations representing working class people, middle class people, to change the priorities of this nation.
From the Republican line, good morning to Foley, Alabama, for Congressman Bernie Sanders.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Good morning, Bernie.
Good morning.
You stole my thunder. I was going to ask you to say that you were a socialist, and you already done it. Another thing I'd like to point out is this is not a democracy. This is a republic. Would you like to debate that? In fact, when you say the Pledge of Allegiance, you basically.
I would just say, sir, that every 2 years people go to vote, and they vote for the candidates of their choice. And I think what that means to me is that we are a democracy with the right to directly elect our people. We have gone beyond the old days where we elect people to the United States Senate. We have direct elections. So I would define us as a democracy. I wish it was a more vibrant democracy. I wish more than 37% of the people would be voting in the next election. But I do believe we are a democracy.
Who do you admire politically?
Well, I think we have had some terrific people historically in our country. Martin Luther King was certainly a very, very great American who had the courage to go beyond the issue of segregation to understanding economic issues and understanding that we needed to change the economy of the country. Eugene V. Debs was a great American as well.
McLean, Virginia, Democrats line, good morning.
Yes, I'm on, right? Am I on?
You sure are.
Okay, well, I'm thrilled. I haven't talked on C-SPAN for months and months. I was just waiting my turn to talk to somebody really important, and Bernie Sanders is that man.
Thank you.
I'm 74 years old. I get a little Social Security check, which is great because it gives me some extra money to spend on those people that are less fortunate than myself. Fortunately, my husband retired from the Department of Interior as a conservationist and range manager and so forth, and he has kind of forced to keep working to earn extra money to pay our expenses to live here in this affluent society of McLean, Virginia, where many of the politicians live in very rich homes, $1 million homes. Anyway, I sort of live in the slums of McLean. I don't even have a carport. Okay, my point is, Bernie Sanders, I think you're the kind of person that Will Rogers was. He said, I think, I don't belong to any organized political party. I'm a Democrat. In other words, I'm a free thinker. My vote is so important to me that I use every source of information I can get before I voice my opinion on a political issue.
Okay. Well, the difference between Will Rogers and me is he had a sense of humor, and I don't. That's a real problem. My wife tells me that. But here's an example of something. Here's a 74-year-old woman who I think indicates she doesn't have a lot of money. She's worried about people outside of her community. And yet you have so much greed in this country. You have guys who make hundreds of millions of dollars a year who sit around fighting for more tax breaks. And I think it's a woman like her who speaks to what this country is, and that is we are a caring nation. We've got to take care of all of our people.
Congressman Bernie